Hi, my name is Jessie Warren, and this is my presentation on the group. The group tells the story of the single fathers due to cancer support group. Don and Justin, two facilitators of the group, along with 7 fathers who had recently lost their wives, met monthly over the span of 4 years. To the facilitators' knowledge, there were no other support groups exactly like this to ever exist. Don and Justin were upfront about this. The group became a partnership. The original structure of the group was tailored to meet the needs of the participants. The format, duration, and scope of the group changed to fit the men's needs. The men chose to refer to themselves as sole parents rather than single parents because their similar situations were not something that they chose. Although healing is by no means linear, the fathers shared and discussed similar life experiences to which they could relate to one another. Common discussion topics were helping their children process the grief, the main reason that all of the men joined, wanting to be better fathers, processing their own personal grief, being a, quote, good enough father, unquote, depression, dating again, religion, and giving back. The men did so with humor that had me cackling throughout the book, which was not something I expected from a book about grief. By the end of the 4 years, the remaining men had created a special bond where they celebrated each other's successes and relished in feelings of togetherness and support. Throughout the book, the authors discuss Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This model was created to recount how people understand their own death, but also applied to the fathers and how they process the deaths of their wives. They also explored the idea of loss versus restoration-oriented stressors and how oscillating between them was frequent and normal for the fathers. Three key clinical realizations of the book and its social work implication for social workers who facilitate groups. One clinical realization of this book is that group participants can and should be able to guide the support group. Don and Justin were very clear that the group was an experiment for everyone. They themselves, although having experience in the realm of cancer treatment, had never facilitated groups before. Because this specific group, single fathers who had lost their wives to cancer, hadn't existed before, there were no blueprints of previous groups to use as structure or as jumping off points. Social workers who facilitate groups should be in the mindset that's open to change. The original structure of this group, in particular, included an educational and teaching component, but the fathers benefited from a more relaxed social conversation environment. Another clinical realization of the book is that grieving is far from a linear process. Throughout the book, Don and Justin discuss Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model. Although the model clarifies the stages of grief, the men, specifically Carl, felt that he didn't fit neatly into this model. He even tried to match his emotional responses to losing his wife to the stages of grief in order to feel any kind of normalcy or control over the situation. Social workers should consider the validity of methodology and theories that they use when facilitating groups. It makes sense that Carl didn't feel connected to this model because there are actually few studies to back it up. Kubler-Ross's original study only included 250 participants. And it was originally created to help people process the idea of their own deaths and mortality rather than the deaths of loved ones. Another clinical realization of this book is that the transparency of the healthcare system is integral to the long-term well-being of grieving families. One of the fathers, Carl, spoke at a medical conference, the Schwartz Rounds, and advocated for end-of-life care, specifically asking medical providers to facilitate conversations between dying people and their loved ones. Families are not in a place emotionally to facilitate those conversations, and it should be the role of the medical professionals. Carl was caught off guard by the death of his wife. Not until 2 weeks before she passed did a doctor, whom they went to get a second opinion from, actually use the word dying and was direct about what was going to happen. Doctors tend to want to instill hope into their patients and families, but Carl and his wife were unable to prepare for her death because by the time they realized she wasn't going to get better, she was nonverbal and non-responsive. Social workers who facilitate groups should never push participants to share their stories for unethical reasons, but support them and empower them to do so if it's of their own free will. Three key observations about the participants' process and the way to address these issues in a group setting. Something I observed immediately was how gender played a role in the father's processing of their grief. The men were willing, when asked if they would be comfortable opening future groups to mothers who were grieving their husbands or same-sex couples who were grieving the loss of their partners. However, they disclosed that they were only comfortable discussing certain topics and aspects of fatherhood and dating, for example, because they were in a group of all men. I think the most effective way to address this in a group setting as a facilitator is to name it directly and create dialogue around it. Because gender roles are so deeply ingrained into society and our normal thought processes, it's not a conclusion that the average person would come to on their own. Another observation I had about the participants' process was their shared use of humor as a coping skill. For example, the fathers exhibited self-deprecating humor in stating, "My children lost the wrong parent." They joked about things such as not keeping up with basic needs for their kids. One of the kids' teachers actually ended up buying their student a new pair of shoes, and the father was mortified of what they would think of him. Social workers in a group setting should not discourage this type of talk. Discussing things that the rest of society would highly judge them for in this safe space created mutual healing through cathartic bonding. A final observation I had regarding the participants' process was that they all realized that they were closer to their children because of these tragedies. Each father had a different number of children at different ages and developmental stages when the mother passed. The reason that all the men joined the group to begin with was to support their children. They stated that they were drawn to the group because it had the word fathers and wouldn't necessarily have been drawn to it if it had just said men. They realized that perfect parenting is not possible or desirable, and not responding to a child's every immediate need may help them tolerate disappointment and frustration in the future as adults. In terms of addressing this in a group setting, a social worker can help a father realize small parenting mishaps would not necessarily harm their children. One event, theme, or process from the book and how it relates to social work awareness of therapeutic group processes. So this is the left side of the screen. The theme of continuing bonds was prevalent towards the end of the book. Preserving connections with deceased loved ones was fundamental to the father's successful adaptation. For example, reminiscing, retaining meaningful possessions, and establishing continuing traditions like visiting the gravesite or keeping up with holiday traditions were helpful in the healing process. One father had a disagreement with his teenage daughter who wanted to go out with her friends on the anniversary of her mother's death, when the father had wanted them to all be together as a family that day. After talking with his fellow group members, he realized that was just her way of coping and that it was different. He apologized to his daughter and they made a compromise. Another father, who was the last in the group to take off his wedding ring, felt very connected to this material possession. He felt that removing the wedding ring was betraying his deceased wife. Eventually, after much berating from his group members, he decided to wear the ring as a necklace. To him, keeping this meaningful possession close to him helped him feel connected to his deceased wife. What is one theme you would now address in a group setting, and why? How did this connect to the book? So this is the right side of the screen. A theme I would like to address in a group setting after reading this book is the importance of prioritizing self-care. It was only after 3 years of meeting did the fathers come to the collective realization that they needed to take care of themselves to take care of their children. Ironically, it was their selflessness that motivated them to join the group. The fathers got to a turning point where they needed, where they stopped worrying so much about day-to-day needs because they were at a baseline, and they were able to think about their futures, happiness, and what the meaning of life looked like for them. People need to determine for themselves what a meaningful, purposeful life is. The other fathers provided much needed encouragement in that realm. For example, most of them had started dating again at that point. However, remarrying was not necessarily the most important or necessary objective to happiness. This did not indicate whether they were getting better. Bruce's self-care journey, for example, involved his evolving relationship to God and the church, whereas other folks were focusing on their physical health for the first time since their wives passed away. I think to connect this to my own social work practice, I would prioritize grounding techniques and check-ins. I like to use an emotion wheel or scale before starting a meeting. And here are my references. Thanks for listening. Bye.